pause and consider this fascinating reality. For over a century and a quarter, the United States functioned entirely without a permanent central bank. During this era, there was no Federal Reserve or singular authority to regulate the money supply or serve as a financial safety net. Astonishingly, despite lacking what we consider a modern financial pillar, the nation transformed from fragile colonies into an industrial powerhouse. The secret behind how the early economy survived is much stranger, messier, and vastly more revealing than people typically imagine. Rather than cruising along smoothly, the young country lurched repeatedly through dramatic cycles of boom, bust, and absolute chaos. His cutting cellars sideways plunged out and dregs. Governments repeatedly experimented with central banking institutions, dismantled them, watched alternatives collapse, and started over. Industrial titans, street-level swindlers, angry presidents, and secretive bankers were all swept up in this grand financial drama. This turbulent history ultimately shaped not just the American economy, but the entire global financial order we rely on today. The eventual creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 remains one of the most extraordinary and consequential episodes in monetary history. Let us journey back to the very beginning, long before the United States possessed even a stable, functioning currency. When independence was declared in 1776, the new nation confronted a threat potentially greater than the British military: money. Lacking the authority to levy taxes and possessing zero gold reserves, the Continental Congress needed a way to fund a revolution. Faced with no financial infrastructure whatsoever, the desperate government resorted to doing what historical regimes always do: printing paper. The parentage had the car and pulls of the jungle Washington. Between 1775 and 1779, leaders authorized millions in new notes known as Continentals, backed by nothing more than empty promises. As the war dragged on and printing presses ran non-stop, public trust vanished and the currency's value plummeted dramatically. By the year 1780, the Continental dollar had plummeted so drastically in value that a single note was virtually worthless. This economic collapse gave rise to a famous idiom of the era, rendering anything entirely useless as not worth a Continental. Troops who had risked their lives on the battlefield received compensation in currency incapable of purchasing basic provisions. Agricultural producers declined to trade their harvests for rapidly depreciating paper, forcing towns back into a system of barter. Such a catastrophic fiscal baptism left deep psychological scars, shaping American monetary debates for generations to come. Having witnessed authorities ruin personal savings through unchecked printing, citizens developed a profound dread of centralized financial control. However, his companions belonged to the teacher. Yet a single visionary emerged, convinced that rescuing the fragile republic required constructing an entirely new monetary framework from the ground up. That individual was Alexander Hamilton, an immigrant orphan from the Caribbean who rose through sheer intellect and relentless drive. Stepping into his role as the inaugural Treasury Secretary under George Washington in 1789, Hamilton confronted an absolute economic disaster. The federal administration carried roughly $54 million in conflict obligations, while individual states owed an additional $25 million. To address this crisis, Hamilton boldly proposed that the central government absorb all state war obligations into one unified national total. He also advocated establishing a central bank modeled after the Bank of England to stabilize money, gather taxes, and issue loans. Hamilton viewed this institution as a vital political mechanism that would bind wealthy merchants directly to the survival of the Republic. Although undeniably brilliant, this ambitious strategy alarmed many citizens who feared the concentration of financial power. The fierce resistance against Hamilton's proposals was spearheaded by two prominent political figures, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson fiercely condemned the project as a deceptive Trojan horse designed to empower northern financial elites at the expense of ordinary working farmers. He maintained that the founding charter granted Congress no explicit permission to charter such a corporation, warning that limitless power would follow. Stepping alongside his ideological ally, Madison cautioned that wealth would dangerously accumulate within a narrow circle of privileged individuals. This heated confrontation violently exposed the initial major ideological fracture dividing the political landscape of the young nation. Federalist defenders backed an active, dominant federal authority, whereas Democratic Republicans championed states' rights and strictly limited governance. Beyond a mere disagreement over currency, this intense struggle effectively defined the fundamental soul and future direction of America. Ultimately prevailing in the dispute, Hamilton persuaded President Washington that implied powers legally justified establishing the institution. Washington officially approved the legislation on February 25, 1791, paving the way for the grand opening in Philadelphia. Boasting a massive capitalization of $10 million, the enterprise immediately established itself as the country's largest corporation, and the enterprise greater the farming of just $30 million, while the federal government secured a 20% stake. Private and overseas investors held the remainder, causing widespread unease. Over 2 full decades, the institution faithfully delivered on its promises by stabilizing currency values and streamlining federal accounts. It extended vital credit to expanding commercial enterprises while actively encouraging fluid trade across state boundaries. By requiring gold and silver redemption, the bank successfully curbed reckless paper money production among state-chartered institutions. The booming economy and restored foreign confidence proved the initiative to be an objective, undeniable triumph. However, objective metrics rarely dictate political survival, and as the 20-year charter neared expiration in 1811, deep trouble loomed. Alexander Hamilton had perished years earlier in his fateful 1804 duel with Aaron Burr, leaving the institution without its founding champion. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans held firm control of the government, while rapidly multiplying state banks chafed under federal regulation. Opponents weaponized the fact that foreign investors owned roughly 70% of the stock, framing it as a threat to citizens. When the renewal measure finally reached the floor, the Senate defeated the charter extension by a single decisive vote. The nation's first central bank was forced to shut its doors, plunging the young republic into uncharted economic territory. Without a national institution to keep them in check, state-chartered banks multiplied rapidly from 88 to over 240. Underfunded and loosely regulated lenders printed massive amounts of paper notes, triggering widespread monetary chaos. Currency values fluctuated wildly across regions, forcing merchants to rely on discount tables and counterfeit detectors just to trade. Fraud ran rampant through the marketplace, with estimates suggesting nearly a third of all circulating paper money was fake. The outbreak of the War of 1812 delivered an immediate and severe test to this fragile financial landscape. Struggling to secure funds for the conflict without a central bank, the Treasury was forced into desperate borrowing measures. The federal government issued bonds at steep discounts and accepted punishing interest rates from local lenders just to survive. By the end of hostilities, the national treasury sat near bankruptcy, while the entire banking system remained in complete disarray. Ideological objections faded as the harsh practical reality of fighting a major war without a central bank became glaringly obvious. Recognizing the critical error, Congress reversed course in 1816 and established the Second Bank of the United States, the first bantam bank in the United States. Stepping into leadership in 1823, a sharp and visionary financier named Nicholas Biddle completely revolutionized the struggling institution. Under his strict discipline and deep monetary expertise, the troubled establishment began operating much like a modern central bank. The stake and style stations put forth control of the plants. Biddle skillfully regulated the broader money supply by strategically expanding and contracting available credit across the country. He established a dependable uniform currency by honoring local banknotes and redeeming them efficiently when circulation grew too high. Providing seamless fiscal services to the government, Biddle even helped completely wipe out the national debt by 1835. This extraordinary milestone marked the only time in American history that the nation has ever been entirely debt-free. The closing years of the decade, this powerhouse institution stood among the most influential financial giants on the planet. Its trusted paper notes circulated everywhere as securely as gold, fueling thriving commerce from Boston to the western frontier. With businesses benefiting from massive loans and the economy humming smoothly, prosperity seemed firmly established nationwide. Then, everything shifted dramatically with the political rise of Andrew Jackson, who captured the presidency in 1828. As a hardened frontier war hero representing everyday citizens, Jackson harbored a fierce hatred for the Eastern financial elite. Having suffered personally from reckless speculation in his youth, he maintained a profound distrust of all banks and paper money. He viewed the powerful national institution as a dangerous hydra of corruption that coddled wealthy stockholders and foreign investors. In Jackson's eyes, the bank actively oppressed ordinary farmers, hard-working laborers, and struggling small business owners daily. Convinced of its corrupting influence, the newly elected president looked upon Nicholas Biddle and his creation with utter contempt. Political opponents in Congress, specifically Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, strategically pushed to renew the bank charter 4 years ahead of schedule. Convinced that an election-year veto would spell political doom, these lawmakers gambled on trapping the president. Their calculations proved entirely mistaken when Jackson firmly rejected the renewal with a fiercely passionate message. "And you know who I am." He condemned the institution as unconstitutional, hazardous to state authority, and a direct threat to public liberty. Challenging established judicial precedent, he boldly asserted his own presidential right to interpret constitutional limits independently. Elevating the banking dispute into the defining theme of the upcoming election, he framed it as a struggle against concentrated wealth. Securing a massive electoral triumph, the president interpreted the landslide results as an undeniable mandate from the citizens. Acting swiftly on this perceived public approval, he directed that all federal funds be pulled from the central institution. These government assets were subsequently dispersed among numerous state-chartered entities that opponents quickly dubbed pet banks. Facing this existential threat, Biddle retaliated by sharply restricting credit and engineered a deliberate economic crunch. His calculated gamble aimed to inflict enough financial pain to compel Congress into overriding the presidential veto. Instead of turning public sentiment against the administration, this aggressive financial warfare only validated Jackson's darkest warnings. Citizens witnessed firsthand how a single unelected financier could intentionally cause widespread distress to safeguard his power. When the official charter finally expired in the year 1836, the Second National Bank was permanently laid to rest. This dramatic demise ushered in an era of unprecedented turbulence that would thoroughly test the resilience of the young American economy. Stepping into this uncharted territory, meant the nation was about to find out if commerce could survive without centralized monetary oversight. Between 1837 and 1863, the country entered what historians officially classified as the chaotic free banking era. During this wild phase, almost anyone who managed to pull together a small amount of capital could legally launch their own financial institution. Federal regulation was completely non-existent, leaving individual states to establish their own minimal guidelines, or virtually none at all. Every single one of these newly minted establishments began printing its own unique paper, money backed by whatever assets they held. This decentralized approach triggered a massive wave of ingenuity, alongside staggering levels of widespread financial fraud. Hundreds or even thousands of distinct banknotes flooded the marketplace, carrying wildly different designs and fluctuating values. Travelers crossing state lines had to constantly evaluate dozens of unfamiliar currencies, trading at unpredictable discounts and premiums. Merchants desperately depended on specialized printed directories called banknote reporters just to figure out what their earnings were actually worth. Navigating this convoluted monetary landscape remained a constant daily nightmare, filled with immense friction and financial peril. Among these eccentric creations, the infamous wildcat banks emerged as the ultimate symbols of this totally unregulated monetary experiment. Operators intentionally placed these shady institutions in remote, unreachable wilderness areas where wildcats supposedly outnumbered potential customers. This clever geographical isolation made it nearly impossible for everyday citizens to redeem their paper notes for actual gold or silver. Michigan provided a notorious example in 1837 when overwhelmed inspectors struggled to keep pace with dozens of dubious startups. Some fraudulent institutions even recycled the exact same chest of coins, parading it ahead of inspectors to fake adequate reserves. Despite the chaos, historians note that the free banking era was far from a total catastrophe across the entire nation. Recent studies reveal that these severe wildcat abuses remained concentrated primarily in states with remarkably weak regulatory frameworks. Meanwhile, institutions operating in places like New York generally functioned quite reasonably and maintained stable operations. Although failure rates climbed high, with over half of these banks eventually shutting down, many closures proceeded in an orderly fashion. The Lord Arvin betrayed failures within the past. In numerous instances, everyday note holders managed to recover most or even all of their invested money. Despite this resilience, recurring financial panics struck the country with devastating force during the 19th century. Today, the country was paralyzed. Dense companies. Major crises erupted in 1819, 37, 57, 73, 93, and 1907. Each devastating panic followed a familiar destructive cycle, fueled by reckless speculation and sudden losses of public confidence. Without a central bank to inject emergency liquidity, falling institutions triggered catastrophic domino effects across the economy. The convenient software reveals historical royalty about the national park. The vulnerable financial framework ultimately relied on desperate coordination, clearinghouse associations, and wealthy private benefactors to survive. In order to ensure the highest and powerful continent solutions, everything changed radically when the outbreak of the Civil War plunged the Union government into a massive fiscal crisis. Faced with the daunting challenge of funding a huge war effort, leaders needed an innovative financial solution immediately. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase engineered a bold strategy that would permanently reshape American banking for decades to come. Congress authorized printing roughly $450 million in distinct paper money, recognized widely as greenbacks. These distinctive bills became the very first truly national currency, designated as legal tender for all public and private debts. To phase out competing currencies, Congress levied a steep 10% tax on notes issued by state-chartered institutions. This aggressive measure effectively forced older state banknotes out of circulation and cemented the federal monopoly. Although this new national structure far outperformed the previous era of banking chaos, it still lacked a central authority. The framework operated without a lender of last resort or any mechanism to inject emergency liquidity during panics. Because the supply of banknotes remained rigidly tied to government bonds, the currency could not adapt to economic shifts. Through this manner society, every autumn, as farmers required credit to transport their harvested crops, money demand surged and interest rates spiked. When that seasonal movement concluded each spring, excess cash flooded back into New York to fuel Wall Street speculation. This land of senior has captured a virus forge over providing the belligerent public international circumstances. This rhythmic financial seesaw generated chronic instability throughout the expanding American marketplace. Particularly in the South and West, farmers strongly felt that the system favored Northeastern industrialists at their expense. The involuntary other farmers continued to navigate to a future like farming. A relentless series of severe economic panics struck the nation in quick succession during the late 19th century. Crisis erupted in 1873, 1884, 1890, and once again in 1893. Each recurring catastrophe drove home the brutal lesson that the American economy remained dangerously exposed to shocks. Without a designated central bank to act as a buffer, the entire financial architecture lacked any stabilizing shock absorber. Whenever public confidence suddenly evaporated, the rigid system completely crumbled under the immense pressure, but captured clearly the knowledge of God. Panicked institutions routinely suspended cash payments as depositors rushed frantically to withdraw their savings. Agricultural communities across the southern and western regions strongly believed the entire monetary apparatus unfairly favored eastern industrialists. Countless enterprises collapsed, while joblessness soared and local towns suffered profound devastation. Eventually, the storm would subside, public trust would revive, and the relentless loop would restart. This combination of fierce economic energy and extreme instability proved entirely unsustainable in the long run. The breaking point finally arrived in October 1907, introducing a uniquely dramatic human element. The official in Parrish promoted comfort. A reckless plot to manipulate the stock of the United Copper Company served as the immediate catalyst for disaster. Speculator Augustus Heinze and partner Charles Morse leveraged a web of financial institutions to fund their ambitious scheme. Frightened clients rushed to pull their capital from affiliated banks the moment the manipulative corner collapsed. New York City trust companies represented a dangerous vulnerability due to their much lighter regulatory oversight. Operating with minimal reserves, these institutions lacked membership in the protective clearinghouse network coordinating major banks. Refusal of emergency backing for the Knickerbocker Trust triggered an immediate and frantic run by depositors. Massive crowds formed endless queues outside, hoping to secure their savings before the vault doors shut. Operations halted entirely on October 22nd, barring thousands of citizens from accessing their personal funds. Because no governmental authority possessed the power to intervene, rescue duties fell entirely onto one legendary financier. J.P. Morgan hurried back from a distant church convention to establish command from his private Madison Avenue library. Operating effectively as a single-handed central authority, Morgan evaluated financial ledgers to determine which troubled firms deserved rescue funds. He personally committed vast personal wealth, while compelling fellow wealthy magnates to contribute matching sums for stabilization. Securing $25 million in federal deposits from the Treasury Secretary further bolstered the dwindling reserves of New York banks. A nation's dedicated for infections and money. To avert a complete stock market crash, he engineered an emergency acquisition of a struggling brokerage firm. California Cabinet, 2007. This crucial transaction demanded direct sign-off from President Theodore Roosevelt, a leader renowned for challenging corporate titans. The feat started water campaign. During one particularly intense night, Morgan physically barred the doors of his library, trapping financial executives inside until they agreed to pledge $25 million. Her first murders became confident. The final resistant executive finally signed the rescue agreement at the remarkably early hour of 4:45 in the morning. Although this aggressive intervention successfully calmed the panic and saved the financial network, it revealed a startling vulnerability. The security of the entire American economy relied entirely on one aging private citizen, willing to force his peers into cooperation. Citizens began questioning how the nation would survive future emergencies if another wealthy savior failed to appear. This profound systemic weakness made it clear that sweeping legislative reform was utterly unavoidable. Spurred by the frightening events of 1907, Congress finally united to address deep-seated banking flaws. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island stepped forward to sponsor legislation establishing the National Monetary Commission to investigate potential solutions. As a prominent Republican ally of Wall Street, Aldrich faced significant public suspicion due to his elite political and familial connections. Determined to find answers, he spent the following 2 years touring Europe to examine foreign central banking models closely. Armed with insights from abroad, Aldrich faced a major hurdle due to deep-rooted public distrust of central banking institutions. Generations of Americans harbored a populist fear of concentrated financial power that could instantly doom any reform effort. Knowing that a transparent approach would fail, the senator orchestrated a deeply secretive gathering in late 1910. The Empire of the 18th of 1929 went to the storm storybook. Under the guise of a casual duck-hunting expedition, several influential men boarded a private railway car in New Jersey. The participants were instructed to use only their first names and maintain absolute secrecy to avoid public suspicion. Their true destination was an exclusive coastal retreat in Georgia, owned by the most powerful titans of the Gilded Age. This elite assembly featured key figures including top Treasury officials, prominent Wall Street partners, and banking executives. Among them stood Paul Warburg, a brilliant immigrant banker whose extensive knowledge of European systems made him indispensable. Tasked with rewriting the nation's monetary future, these elite men began drafting a blueprint behind closed doors. Their clandestine meetings laid the critical foundation for a unified banking framework that would transform the entire country. Although hidden from public view for decades, the decisions made on that private island forever altered American economic history. A system born in total secrecy ultimately birthed the modern central banking architecture we recognize today. Understanding how financial power shifted behind the scenes reveals the complex roots of our contemporary monetary landscape. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden piece of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives. Let's face the Tideland Death Gone. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what historical mysteries we should explore next.